The old style of webinars that we've all seen too many of would just have two sections really, and maybe a Q&A at the end. They would have section 2, right, which is how do I know I can trust you and what you're showing me, and then how does it work? And the how does it work section would consume 90+% of the of all of the structured content, and it still qualifies for most of, it's the single largest section in a lot of webinars. It actually is 40 to 55% or so of the entire thing, maybe 60. But it has been shrunk down a bit so that we can frame up the audience, we can grab their attention, we can like establish our credentials, we can frame them up with negative present, positive future, and then we can move into our content and they're in the right frame of mind, as opposed to relying on your slides and knowing right from the beginning that they should be interested in what it is you're going to show them. Because before we did all this kind of stuff, we just had introduce the speaker and then go right into the details, like the meat of the presentation. What we ended up with was, if the first couple of slides or the first couple of minutes of the how does it work section weren't interesting, audience attention would just immediately start to bleed, and the bleeding never stopped until the whole thing was over. Now we spend a few extra minutes and we frame up the audience with their expectations and interest the audience, calm the audience, let the audience know that they're in the right place with the title slide, but also in the right place as in thematically, subject-wise, company-wise, the problem they're having. They're in the right audience because this is what we're talking about. And then you move into how does it work? Now, how does it work is where you get to geek out. And I don't normally try to change too much about what an expert speaker is going to show in the how does it work. I spent my whole life in tech. It's pretty rare that I don't understand whatever they're talking about. But this is the only part of the presentation where they're usually so comfortable that they just shine. And any little bits, anytime it might drag a tiny bit or whatever, I don't mind, because the audience can tell that, like, finally the speaker is talking about something that like they really are interested in themselves, right? The speaker knows it. The speaker lives this. It's fantastic. I do put in a couple of guardrails around that speaker's content. First, as much as possible, you minimize the number of complex slides. Now, you'll see these really stupid rules about, only have 6 words on a slide or whatever. That doesn't work for these kind of webinars. These kind of webinars are informational webinars with a little bit of aspirational messaging. But the audience is there for details. So just showing them 6 words per slide and telling them a bunch of stories and anecdotes about the lessons you learned in kindergarten or from your dog, that's for B2C kind of audiences. That is not for technical / explainer kind of webinars like we're talking about here, which are the bulk of B2B webinars. So instead, the guardrails are keep the number of slides with, do keep down the number of words on a slide. 6 is ridiculous, but it's certainly okay to have, 30 words on a slide. Absolutely. 40 even, if you do it right, it's fine. Secondly, the number of complex diagrams need to be kept to an absolute minimum. In fact, I not only recommend that you keep it to 1 for presentations that don't have a very complex slide, I insist that 1 be brought in. The reason for this is that one of the aims of this section, there are a few goals for the how does it work section: communicating overt messages and underlying messages at the same time. The overt messages are, we're being transparent about this. We've done all the thinking on this subject. We've done all the work already. Some customers, you worry they're going to build the solution themselves. We've done all the thinking. We've done all the work. We're being transparent. Here it all is. The underside of that is, this is complicated, and you can just shortcut yourself to a positive future by giving us money. And one of the ways that you convey that it's complicated and not worth building yourself is that you need at least 1 slide that's so complicated that you slightly overwhelm the audience. It's so detailed that the customer, don't give away anything proprietary that would be a competitive disadvantage down the road. But everything short of that, throw it on there. And because you're messaging to your audience Like, it took us a while to do this, right? It took us time, it took us money, it took us resources. There was a lot of trial and error, probably. This is not something you just slap together and go. And I mean, here's like just a sample of it. Look how complicated this is. Now, you don't spend any time emphasizing how complicated your solution is. You let the graphic do that for you, right? The whatever it is, a workflow, an infographic, a project plan, screenshot, like whatever you're going to put up there. Just make sure that there's a lot of it. It's busy. It's relatively small type. And your other diagrams can expand out and zoom in and make things very easy to read. This one needs to be slightly hard to read because you're trying to overwhelm the audience a little bit and let them know, like, okay, like clearly these guys know what they're doing and there's a lot to it. Let's just like bring them in and have them run a demo, do the bake off, show it to us, do our deep dive technical meeting, whatever it is you're trying to get to with this kind of webinar. The other thing you're trying to achieve with the how does it work section is I recommend that you break it and think of it as a part 1 and part 2. Ultimately, in script writing terms, this is actually act 2 of a 3-act structure. Everything up to this was act 1, sort of like establishing ourselves, creating tension. We got the cold open. We're building up. We've shown them the positive future. We've assured them that it's not their fault that they're getting their ass kicked in the market, but that doesn't mean that they should keep getting their ass kicked in the market. Here's a better way, right? That's all act 1. Act 2, how does it work? Give us the details. Slightly overwhelm us. Be transparent, but show us that you've done all the work, all the thinking on this. I recommend that you split this into 2 parts yourself. Part 1 is exactly what you would have normally done. Talk about whatever, in whatever order makes sense. And you sort of end act 1, or you get to the act 2 rather. You sort of end part 1, the first half of how does it work, with that complicated diagram or a couple of diagrams, a couple of slides that like really drive home the fact that this is not something you can just slap together in a weekend at your company and you don't have to pay us for anything. Then I suggest you pivot for the second half of that how does it work section. Now, there's another video in this series that talks about the difference between a deep dive pivot and a horizontal pivot. I'm going to go over them here as well because it's worth repeating, and B, maybe we can provide a little more context to it. You've already shown them in the first half. Let's say that this section is going to take 20 minutes. The first 10 minutes of it, you showed them blah, blah, blah. It's kind of the same thing you would have always shown them within the guardrails that I just discussed. Part 2, you're going to do some kind of deep dive. So you're either going to pick one thing, probably ideally the most interesting thing that audience would find interesting, one aspect, one feature, one concept, one capability, whatever, and you're going to go way deep into it. So let's take a minute and discuss feature ABC. And then in you go, and you go way down into it. You're down in the weeds, like you're really sort of fleshing it out for them, right? You don't have time in a webinar to flesh out everything. You don't have time in a webinar to flesh out one thing to exhaustion, but you can flesh it out enough so that it's impressive what you guys have actually built or created or invented or whatever, right? It's like, wow, like, at a top level, it seemed like, oh, that's a good thing to have. But once he explained it, it's like, man, there's a lot to that. And it's really clever the way they've put that together. That's what you're aiming for. Your other option, if you're not going to do a deep dive, is to do a horizontal pivot. The horizontal pivot is where you talk about something adjacent to where the audience is so that they get a sort of a more rounded context of how functional or utilitarian or useful your product is. So you guys are all in the specialty paint industry and you're making this, we've talked about that. The product is really versatile. And I want to take a few minutes just to give you this example about how people on Etsy have been buying it in order to make the most amazing looking artistic paintings you've ever seen. And then you can just do that, right? Now, is it directly related to your product? Not exactly. But what you're doing is, A, you're breaking up the monotony of a long how does it work section with an application. But what you're also doing is implanting in their heads, not only have these guys done all this stuff, but if painters on Etsy can make portraits using this like specialty paint ingredient, I bet we could apply it to all kinds of stuff inside our company that we haven't even thought of yet. right? That's what you're aiming for. So you're showing them sort of another version of your TV show where, everybody lives on the moon. It's like, wow, that's like really great. But if they could do that there, I bet we could do this here. So that's what you're aiming for. That's a horizontal pivot. So you either do a deep dive or you do a horizontal pivot. I mean, theoretically, you could do both. I don't see it very often, and almost never with new audiences. If an audience is, keeps showing up to your webinars because you're doing maybe one a month and it's always new content, you might get away with a longer how does it work section, and you would have time. In fact, you might even break it up into a 3-part how does it work. You start with an application, the adjacent application, the horizontal pivot, the painters on Etsy. And then you move into like how the actual product works and what it is and your workflow and your complicated. And then you finish off with a deep dive of like one interesting feature or capability. And then you finish up. So that's the how does it work section. It will always contain the traditional kind of presentation that your subject matter expert has always given. We're just going to put some guardrails around it, and then we're going to sort of try to cut it at about the halfway point or maybe the 65% mark for that section. And for the last half or third of their how does it work section, they either do a deep dive pivot or a horizontal